Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to continue covering games from Barcelona. And in this game, which is one of my favorites in the tournament, I played the London with black. And I have to say, I've been playing it with black for a long time now, but I'm enjoying it more and more. And there's a ton of venom in the opening. And there are positions which you don't normally get with the white pieces, because you're a tempo down when playing the London with black, you often have to compromise. And plans often differ. You don't go for quick attacks, even though there are some similar patterns. You play more positionally. Let me show you what happened. My opponent is 2136, so 200 points higher rated. He started with knight f3, I played d5, and now he played b3. He plays different combinations of g3, b3, c4, d3, either Nimzo Larsen or Reti type setups, even King's Indian attacks sometimes. I just continued knight f6, bishop to b2, and now c6. Now, c6 may seem like a passive move. You can play these positions with c5 and knight c6, in which case both c4, d4, and e4 are more annoying for different reasons. I'm not going to get into all of that now. But playing c6 against a setup I knew he was going to play, which is g3, the double fianchetto, is very safe. Now you play bishop f5, he plays bishop to g2, I play e6. You have a normal London, there are no problems in the position, c4 and e4 are not scary, and white still has to show what he's going to do. One thing you have to note in these positions is that knight h4 is never a threat until d3 has been played, because on any knight h4 you can simply go bishop to g4, making knight h4 absolutely pointless. If white has to play f3, then he is in trouble, because you simply play bishop to g6 if this is taken. This structure is bad, e4 would be a weakening move, f4 would be a weakening move, and basically castling kingside is extremely risky. Doesn't really work. Okay, so he played d3 here. This is the signal that you need to do something about knight h4, therefore h6. Okay, knight bd2, normal, knight bd7, white castles, and normally in the London you play bishop to d3 with white. Here that would be bishop to d6. There are two reasons why that would be a bad move here. The most important one is white has to play e4. This is basically a King's Indian attack with a queenside fianchetto. Once white plays e4, sometimes he can follow that up with e5 because it's defended enough by the knight, and if you put the bishop on d6 you lose a piece. The second reason is white has fianchettoed, so a bishop targeting this pawn chain doesn't really do much. The third reason not to play bishop to d6 but bishop to e7 is that in some positions, if knight h4 is played, or if h4 is played, you want the bishop to be controlling g5 and h4. Sometimes because of sacrifices on h4, sometimes because you ruin their pawn structure and win a pawn. But yeah, generally a more useful move. Bishop c5 doesn't really make much sense because it could be used as a tempo gain either with b4 or d4 later on. Okay, white continues rook e1, therefore preparing e4. And now one very common theme is that you don't want to lose a tempo after e4, so you retreat in advance. Now this gives you several upsides. As you're going to see in the game, having retreated this bishop back to h7, once this tempo move comes, I have a choice. I don't have to retreat the bishop. There are very, very nice patterns such as knight c5, queen b6, bishop c5, which can disrupt white's play. Okay, white plays e4 anyway, and I just castled. The other thing you have to be aware of here is, firstly, e5 is not a good move. It's never a good move, because if e5 is played, then white is basically playing against a good French, because my bishop is on h7, not on c8. He doesn't have the kingside space, because with the pawn on g3, f4 would be an extremely risky move to play with all the pieces on the board. I have to say that e5 would be even worse had I not played knight b to d7 already. Let me just show you a similar position without knight b to d7. Let's just say I do nothing and he gets to play e4, e5. In this case, I wouldn't, of course, play knight b to d7. I would have the d7 square for my f6 knight, and after white castles, I would be able to go c5 and knight to c6. And now this is a perfect French defense for black. But that's a different story. Okay, so I did play knight bd7 in the game, and once e5 came, I had to play knight e8. Now, knight e8 may seem like a passive move. It's not a passive move, it's a very good move, because I'm going to play knight to c7. And once I break the position open with f6, which is something you do in the French, this knight is defending the key e6 pawn, and it can also sometimes come to d5 or to b5 once I play d4. So this is a pretty good knight. Okay, another reason why e5 is bad, and this completely changed the nature of the position, is that now this bishop is a bad piece. There's no other way to put it. It's a bad piece. This pawn restricts white's pieces way more than black's, and as you can see, my bishops are perfect. My pieces have a lot of scope. More importantly, I have a pawn break, which I'm going to play eventually to break open the position. And white doesn't. c4 doesn't do much, b4, b5 is too slow, so yeah, nothing really going on. Okay, queen e2 played, which is okay, and I played knight to c7. And black is slightly better in this position. As I said, because of the pawn on e5, white has to be extremely careful, and it's very hard to suggest moves and plans for white. If something like rook to d1, for example, then simply a5. And if white doesn't do anything, I'm going to play a4. If white plays a4, I'm going to play b5. And all of a sudden, I either have way more space or I have a passed pawn, if that's taken. So this would be incredible for me. What else can he do? I mean, it's really hard to suggest plans. My opponent blundered dreadfully and fell into a pattern which I almost won a game with. My opponent drew in the end, but I should have won. You can find the game here in the link. He played pawn to c4, and this loses the game on the spot. Why? Because my bishops are so great, because d3 has been weakened by e4 and c4, I can simply play knight c5 and win the game. This now wins a pawn and more. I mean, what can he do? He loses material, whatever he does. If he tries to move the rook away from the fork in advance, this still just wins, because I take on d3, the bishop is attacked, and it's game over. It's too much. It's just way too much. In the game, he played pawn to d4, knight d3 simply wins. He cannot defend the bishop and save the exchange, because if rook eb1, then I simply take, and after rook b2 I play bishop a3, which is again very similar to the game I have linked above. So basically I use the same pattern twice to get a winning position. So that cannot be done. He has to give up the exchange, so he played bishop c3, I just took. Takes, and now this is over. This is an exchange up for absolutely nothing. Not to mention that white's pieces are still worse than mine. These two bishops. I mean, this one could come to h3, but this one has no hope, except for trading. And at this point, trading pieces off just makes it easier for black. Okay, I have a plan. I want to break the position with f6, so f6. There's no need to wait here. I'm simply better. I'm material up. My pieces are better. e6 has been defended. Taking on f6 would be pretty disastrous, because I can just go rook f6 and double up. So he played knight d3. I took on d3. There's no reason not to take. This bishop doesn't really need a counterpart, and this knight cannot be allowed to come to e5 if I take on e5. And also I don't want to play f5. So take the bishop, queen takes, and now fe5, d5. Yeah, this is now pretty simple. Bishop to c5, double pressure on f2 has to be defended. Queen e7, preventing b4 and a3 b4, and also preparing rook to d8 to make sure I could play dc at some point. Knight to f3 played. He wants to fork my pieces with knight h4, knight g6. Unfortunately, that's very obvious. and it doesn't work. I played rook ad8, he played knight h4, and I simply played queen to f7. He did play knight g6 in the end, which makes it far easier for black because I get to trade queens. Again, it's hard to suggest moves. Maybe bishop h3. I really don't know. Maybe even bishop d4 because this bishop is too good. But he played knight g6 and I simply played queen f5. Of course, he doesn't have time to take the rook because I win his queen. So he has to trade, and once we trade, I take with the rook. He played bishop h3 with tempo. Rook f7. As I said, this knight on c7 is very good, defending my only weakness. He played b4 here. And now I don't have to retreat my bishop, even though I could. Maybe bishop f8 is the safest option, but there's really no need for that. I can just win immediately with rook to f3. If he takes on c5, I take on c3. If he moves the bishop away on this diagonal, then I can just win the pawn on b4. If he plays bishop to e1, that's a pretty sad move. I could go bishop d4. So yeah, he took, and rook takes c3, c takes d5, c takes d5. Now there's pressure on c5 as well. He played knight f4. I simply defend on e6. He played knight e2, attacking my rook. I just took on c5, and now pawn to f4. Now what I have to be careful about, the only thing I have to be careful about is f5 coming and causing some issues. It's not that they're tough to deal with, but that's still the only source of counterplay for him. I'm controlling the c file, I have an extra exchange, I have an extra pawn, so I have to deal with f5. Once I've dealt with that, it's an easy win. So I played rook f8, and if f5 comes here, for example f5, I can just play king e7, and if he takes, I trade the rooks off and then take. So f5 doesn't work. He played knight to d4, which is a good move, reinforcing f5, therefore g6. He played g4, again reinforcing f5, and now g4 has a weakness, so rook to c3. The bishop is undefended, so f5 is impossible. I would take the bishop. He played king g2. And now I played king e7. And the point is that f5 is again not a good move, because if he plays f5 and captures, I can just take the rook and then take the bishop, or take the bishop and then take the rook. So he played rook f3. I mean, this is objectively the best move in the position, but practically speaking, you're trading off your rook, so you're basically conceding the game, because without a rook you have no counterplay. So I of course traded. King takes, a6, a prophylactic move. I don't want a knight in this on d6. Why would I allow that? He played a4, preventing b5, which I don't want to play anyway. I want to win this pawn later somehow. I played knight e8. Knight e8 is another prophylactic move. What I want to do is I want to use my rook on the c file. I don't really want it preventing f5. So I want to play knight g7 to control f5 instead, because my rook is more useful. Bishop f1 played, knight to g7. Now f5 is never happening. Now the only source of counterplay has been prevented, and I can play safely from here. Bishop to d3, king f7, defending the weakness. He played h4. I played rook c8, activating my rook. King e3 in anticipation of rook c3. So rook c1. And I'm gonna either target this one, or target this one, or target this one. The rook is just great at picking at weaknesses. The bishop and the knight aren't really able to deal with that. He played bishop e2. I played rook h1, provoking him to play h5. If h5 is not played, then he loses a pawn. h5, gh5. And now, of course, if he takes, I win another pawn. If he pushes, I have knight f5 check. So he played f5. It doesn't work, though. Because I have two defenders on e6, I can simply win another pawn. So h takes g4. And as I said, fe6 doesn't work. f6 doesn't work either, because I just check and trade the knight off. So knight takes, e takes, king f4, king e6. And now, of course, This is an overwhelming material advantage, but I have to be careful. There are two problems I have to deal with. One of them is if the bishop comes to this diagonal and he takes and king takes, then he queens the pawn. So I have to be careful about that. Also, I have to be careful about taking on e5 because, again, f7, f8, queen. Also, bishop to d3 targets my weakness. So I've seen all of this and I was ready to deal with it, and I took my time on each turn to make sure I don't blunder. But yeah, there's still some venom in the position. Okay, bishop to d3, rook h5. Seems passive, but it's really not that passive, because once I play rook to g5, I can play rook to g8 and take on e5 and push my g pawn. Whoa, and push my g pawn. Bishop c2 played, preparing to get to this diagonal and maybe take and queen his pawn. And here I decided to give up one pawn for activity. Maybe I can play rook g5 straight away. But there's really no need for that. I can just play g3. This is a safer conversion, because once the king moves away, I get to do everything I want with tempo. So rook g5 with tempo. The king comes to f3 and I played rook to g8. Of course, if I take on e5, then f7 wins, so I have to play rook g8 first. Therefore, he defends king f4. I chase the king away once more, king e3, and now rook to c4. I'm cutting the king away on this rank, and of course f7 has been prevented. And now it's over. Now there is no more counterplay, because everything is defended. I'm just going to be pushing my pawns. He played bishop d3, I played rook c3. Of course, again, this is just over. If I take the bishop, then I have too many passed pawns. So he played the only move to sort of stay in the game. Or, yeah, not really, a5. I can just take the bishop straight away and just push my pawns. But I took on e5 to make it simpler. f7 doesn't work now because I have rook c8. And yeah, the game finished in a couple of moves. Bishop e2. Rook f8, bishop h5 defending, f4 check, king d3, king f5, king d4, king g5. The bishop moved away. They took on f7, and this is how the game ended. I'm pushing my pawns, and I took the bishop, and here he resigned. Obviously, I'm going to make 3 queens. Yeah, I'm very happy with the London for black, I have to say. I'm enjoying the opening more so than with the white pieces, because it's more positional in nature than with white. With white, it's often an attacking setup. With black, it's a safe, solid, almost Caro-Kann-like position in which you can adapt depending on what your opponent does. And regardless of whether your opponent plays the English or the Reti or starts with the Nimzo Larsen, a million different setups. You can play the London against it. And yeah, it's very hard to break through. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you got something from this if you play knight f3 or c4 or b3 with white. And especially if you're looking for a safe setup with black. The London with black is a great opening. Okay, thank you very much. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.